Good evening. I'm David Falcone, and I'm president of the Southborough Historical Society, and I want to welcome you and thank you all for coming tonight and supporting the society. We have a wonderful program that I think you're really going to enjoy. I'd like to thank the board of directors of the Southborough Historical Society for all the work they've done preparing for this program tonight, and I'd also like to thank them for the work they do all year long to keep the society going and the Southborough Historical Museum open. We do have membership applications in the back, and we'd love to have you join if you're not already a member. I'd also like to thank the members of the New England Patriots End Zone Militia for providing security for President Adams tonight. Thank you, boys. Go Pats! I'd like to take a moment and give you a quick history lesson and tell you about the flag behind me. This is a 15-star, 15-stripe flag that was authorized by the Flag Act of January 13, 1794, and became the official United States flag on May 1, 1795. 2 stripes and 2 stars were added to the original flag for the admission of Vermont, the 14th state, in 1791, and Kentucky, the 15th state, in 1792. It was our nation's flag for 23 years until April 12, 1818. During the bombardment of Fort McHenry on September 13, 1814, Francis Scott Key was inspired by the sight of this flag flying over the fort to write a song which became known as the Star-Spangled Banner, now our national anthem. The 15-star flag is itself affectionately known by the same name. This is the only U.S. flag to ever have more than 13 stripes. 5 presidents served under this flag: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. The flag behind me actually flew over Fort McKinley for a brief period of time. I would like to ask you to stand now and place your hand over your heart and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance of our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. God bless America. Ladies and gentlemen, our special guest this evening was born in Braintree, Massachusetts. He practiced law in Boston until he was selected to represent Massachusetts at the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. He was ambassador to France, Holland, England, and served as vice president in the administration of George Washington. Please welcome the second president of the United States, John Adams.
Thank you very much. I'll let you retire. Well, when I told my wife Abigail that I was coming to Southborough tonight, she predicted that I would get the fine welcome that I just received from you all, because she said Southborough has always been a stronghold for the Federalist Party. But she says, no matter how much they welcome you, John, remember this: you're not to run for president again. Of course, she must be obeyed. Now, I was the 5th generation of Adamses to live in Massachusetts. My grandfather's grandfather emigrated from England, and he himself went on to have 89 grandchildren. Imagine the Christmas presents, and that's the way it was done, by the way. It was the elder who would give presents to the younger, not the younger to the elder. So 89 presents necessarily had to have been exchanged or handed down. And so when someone whose last name is Adams comes up to me and says, "Mr. President, do you think we are related?" I always said, well, how could we not be? You know, my father was a farmer in Braintree, Massachusetts. A lot of people think that the Adamses were aristocrats. He was a farmer, and in the cold periods when you couldn't go outside to work, he became a cobbler. Also, they think that the Adamses were intellectuals, long tradition of learning. That wasn't true at all. They were farmers. And in fact, my mother never learned how to read. My father, in fact, wanted to become a minister. And he would have become a minister, became a deacon, but he did not have a college education. So, of course, what you can't do, you want your children to do. So when I was 16, he sold several acres of his land in Braintree, Massachusetts, and used the money to pay my tuition so that I could attend the local community college called Harvard. And my father wanted me to become a clergyman, and indeed, most of my college class went on to be ministers. But when I graduated, I told my father that I wanted to become a lawyer, which was a profession considered several tiers below that of a minister. Even then. And my father and I had a huge argument about this. And he said, you know, the plans, I sold acres of my farm so you could do this, and now you want to become a lawyer. So we finally decided to compromise, and I would teach school for 2 years in Worcester, Massachusetts, while I rethought my desire to become a lawyer. Now, if anyone has ever been to Worcester, Massachusetts, you know that spending 2 years or almost any time at all is pretty tough. Is there anyone here from Worcester, Massachusetts? Well, thank God. But there I was. I started teaching school in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the way they referred to it was keeping school. And I soon realized that my pupils had all of the intelligence of their parents, really. These are miniature adults. And they could know right away weaknesses in my arguments and errors in my reasoning, and more important, whether or not I really believed in what I was saying. And you know, corporal punishment was used throughout the Massachusetts school at that time, but I never used it because I thought that my pupils were better educated with patience, encouragement, and occasional praise. And initially, I thought that teaching school would be a total waste of 2 years of time, but I later realized that it was through teaching that I gained my best skill that I was able to use for the rest of my life, because teaching taught me how to be persuasive. Because if you can persuade a 13-year-old to do the right thing, you can persuade anybody to do the right thing, including a Congress sitting in Philadelphia. Are there any teachers here who are, and oh, that is a wonderful profession, and I certainly knew that. And you know, that influenced me when I wrote the Constitution for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1779. It's the oldest existing constitution in the United States, Constitution in the United States. I put in there the obligation that the municipality and the state had for universal education of boys and girls. And I don't think I would have known that that was such an important thing if I hadn't been a teacher and knew what teachers were doing and what an effect they would have on people's lives. But after 2 years of teaching school, and much to my father's disappointment, I started reading the law with an attorney in Worcester. And that's the way you became a member of the bar in colonial Massachusetts. And after several about a year, I was able to open up my own legal practice right from my home in Braintree, Massachusetts. And 2 years later, I moved my growing practice to Boston, which was a big city then, with a population of 15,000 people. That's what went for a big city. You know, we had a population in the colonial America at that time between 3 and 4 million, but everyone was on a farm. They were not in the cities. In fact, the biggest city at that time was Philadelphia. It had a population of 45,000 people. A group that I spoke to last month in Boston told me that now Boston has a population of 15,000 lawyers. But luckily, not while I was there. You know, early in my career as a lawyer, and indeed growing up, I was proud to be an Englishman. And I know that sounds hard to believe. John Adams was proud to be an Englishman because I was such a promoter of independence later in my life. But I was proud of the English form of government, its culture, its laws, its literature, and especially its beautiful language. And to be patriotic meant to be loyal to the King of England. And we would start every assembly in colonial Massachusetts by stating our patriotism and singing God Save the King. And I think you all know how it goes, but I'll just sing the first verse. God save our gracious King, long live our noble King. God save the King. Make him victorious, happy and glorious, to reign over us. God save the King. Hey. Wouldn't you like to hear that just once in Fenway Park? The game would be over. But I tell you, sometimes I regret starting a revolution and losing that wonderful song. Another time I remember feeling the thrill of patriotism and singing that song was when I was a school teacher in Worcester. And there was a regiment of British soldiers bivouacked outside of town on their way to march up to Canada and fight in the French and Indian War. And everyone in the town, including my students and myself and the parents, we brought pies and beer and all sorts of things and gave it to them, and we were so proud of their bravery. And we all gathered together around their campfires, and we sang, God Save the King. And yet, there came a time when hardly anyone wanted to sing that song anymore. And for most of us, the king was probably the last person we would have wanted God to save. So what went so dreadfully wrong in the relationship between England and the American colonies? You know, I've often said that the War of Revolution, the War of Independence, started in 1775. You remember Lexington and Concord. But the American Revolution started in the minds and the hearts of the colonists more than 15 years before those first shots were fired in Lexington and Concord. So what went so dreadfully wrong? And the answer was, it all started with the French and Indian War in the 1750s, because after the British victory over the French There was a huge debt that had to be paid. You might say there was a financial crisis in London, and London decided to solve it by taxing the colonies to pay that debt from the war. And we in the colonies thought that was so unfair for two basic reasons. One was, Great Britain, you just acquired Canada. Now, isn't that a big enough prize? And secondly, why should we in the colonies be taxed by a government sitting in London when we had no representatives to that government sitting in London? No taxation without representation was the way people put it. And this conflict escalated year after year and was most pronounced in Boston. Taxes were increased and the colonists' reaction was more and more vociferous, followed by soldiers being garrisoned in all of the major cities in the colonies. And this led to the worst incident in anyone's memory, the Boston Massacre of March 1770, when a group of 14 British soldiers were being surrounded by a mob of 500 Bostonians who had snowballs and rocks and ice and oyster shells, and was gradually coming closer and closer, looking like they were going to trample these soldiers, shouting at the soldiers, "Go ahead and fire your weapons," and shots were fired by the soldiers, and 6 of the Bostonites were dead in the street. And those soldiers were arrested and charged with murder. And the next day I was asked to become their defense counsel, represent these terrible soldiers who had just killed my own townspeople. And I decided that I wanted to represent them. Even though I would probably be hated, I would be the most hated person in Boston, even by my own clients, or as Abigail put it, "You mean your former clients, John?" And I did this because I did not want these soldiers to receive a kind of rough mob justice, which would have reminded the world that Massachusetts hadn't progressed very far since the days 100 years before, when we would execute Quakers and stone Salem witches. And more important, I wanted to prove to myself that we lived by the rule of law. And obviously this was a case of self-defense, and that's how I tried the case. The soldiers fired because they otherwise were going to be killed by this mob. And the Boston Massacre trial took place in October and November 1770, 6 months after the massacre occurred, to try to cool off tempers of people as much as could be done. And this trial is noteworthy in legal history because it was the first time in a colonial court where the judge instructed the jury, "You cannot convict unless you are convinced of that person's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." That's the first time this concept was ever pronounced on this side of the Atlantic in the Boston Massacre trial. Well, that presented a much higher standard of proof. Before, it was just preponderance of the evidence. You know, you see the justice, statue of justice, and the two wells over this one. Preponderance of evidence. That means, is it more than 51%? Do you think it's... No, that's not the standard for beyond a reasonable doubt. It means there can't be anything on that side of the scale. Nothing reasonable that you could ever give credit of the person's guilt or innocence. Wow. And so I had to explain to the jury, why is it that we seem to bend over backwards, as some people would say, to protect the guilty? Why do we make it so difficult to convict somebody who has committed a crime? And people ask that all the time, and I'm sure they're asking that in your own world today. Why is it so difficult? Why do we make it so difficult? The reason is this, and I put this in my autobiography, that it is of more importance to the community that innocence be protected than it is that guilt should be punished. More importance that innocence be protected than guilt should be punished. It's as simple as that. If we were going to punish everyone, whether or not they're guilty or innocent, why would anyone decide to be innocent? And in the end, all but 2 of the soldiers were found not guilty. And those 2 soldiers weren't found guilty of murder, they were found guilty of manslaughter. And manslaughter is a much lesser crime. It means that out of negligence, fear, incompetence, you killed somebody without having the real intent of killing them. It was not a capital crime. And the judge otherwise would have sentenced these 2 soldiers immediately after the verdict, but he said, I'm going to wait until tomorrow morning to sentence these 2 soldiers because I want counsel to review the ancient British rule called benefit of clergy. And we will resume this court session tomorrow morning. Now, when a judge, you're a trial lawyer, when a judge gives you a signal, he's the one who's deciding everything. He's giving you a signal, whether that signal makes any sense at all. You have to follow it. You have to figure out what is he talking about. So my co-counsel and I said, what is he talking about? These are 2 soldiers. These are not 2 clergymen. What is he talking about? And what it meant was that it said that if a clergyman is convicted of a non-capital offense, it's not murder, but something lesser than that, the most that a civil judge could do is to have their thumbs branded. The idea being that the ecclesiastical court, the church court, would take care of this clergyman's wrongdoing. These are not clergymen, these are 2 soldiers. So that night we visited them in their cell, and I asked them, do you know any prayers? And one of them said, oh yes, Mr. Adams, I was an altar boy in England, and I served on so many funerals that I know the 23rd Psalm by heart. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me, etc., etc. So I said, that is excellent. You will recite that tomorrow morning. And you? And he said, Mr. Adams, the other soldier said, I haven't been to church in my life. So I brought a Bible, and I said, you will teach him the 23rd Psalm. So the next morning, the judge ordered in the court, and the judge came in, and he sat down, and he said, before I sentence these 2 men, I want to know, does defense counsel have anything else to add? And I stood up and yes, Your Honor, I would like to prove that these 2 men are clergymen. And everyone in the court just laughed. Order, order, all right, what proof do you have? And I had the first soldier get up, and he recited the 23rd Psalm beautifully, no mistakes. The second one gets up, and after about 4 lines, he is in trouble. At which point the judge said, all right, I have heard enough. I will find that these 2 men are clergymen, and I will have them sentenced. The sentence will be that their thumbs will be branded with the letter M for manslaughter, and then they will be sent back to their units. And I regarded this as a full exoneration of my clients. I was so happy, and yet, in my happiness, I said to myself, what am I going to do? I mean, not only did I represent these horrible British soldiers who killed my townspeople, but I got the soldiers off. And I really thought that my career as a lawyer in Boston was over, and I'd have to go to New York or Philadelphia to continue to practice law. And yet I discovered that the people of Boston actually respected the fact that I had taken on these obnoxious defendants. And they did not connect me with their hatred for the defendants. And that's been a tradition in American law that started with John Adams defending the British soldiers. And it's a very healthy thing for the law, because every body charged with a crime should have a lawyer to represent him, and the lawyer shouldn't be worried about what would happen to him. And by the way, you know, I've heard of things like being tarred and feathered. I was given so many threats during the trial, but I always knew that my cousin, who was Sam Adams, who was the head of the Sons of Liberty, would make sure that nothing would happen to me, or else they would, whoever did anything to me would hear from the Sons of Liberty. And that brings up another idea here. I see that you have my cousin's beverage here, Sam Adams. And actually, Sam Adams, their relationship, his father and my father were first cousins. And Sam Adams and I were one of the 5 delegates ultimately to the Continental Congress, and we were very good friends. And we treated one another as relatives and cousins. But I do remember one time when I was in Philadelphia, I bought Abigail a beautiful dress, and I sent it to Boston, and it was delivered to Mrs. Sam Adams. and I wondered why Abigail never said anything about it. And ultimately, I went to Boston and I see Mrs. Sam Adams, and there she's wearing my wife's dress. She got it somehow, and she thought her Sam Adams sent it to her. But people say, well, how do you like his beverage? And I say, well, my favorite alcoholic beverage has always been hard cider. Hard cider, by the way, has twice the alcohol content of beer or ale. And I have a full tankard of hard cider every morning at breakfast. And Abigail said, oh, John, do you have to? And I always say, it improves my digestion, Abigail, as well as my disposition, if you know what I mean. But, you know, I think the secret to my health after being traveling from all around, you know, the colonies and then to Paris, Holland, and London, and living into my 90s was the fact that I would have a full tankard of hard cider every morning for breakfast. You know, there are not many things that can live in a system that is so primed that way. Now, in 1774, I was recruited to represent Massachusetts as one of the 5 delegates to the Continental Congress sitting in Philadelphia. And it was being organized because all of the colonies had our common problems with Great Britain, and we didn't want Great Britain to be negotiating one, and we wanted to, sort of a union, so they would have to deal with us all, and not just one at a time, which is a very smart move. And I remember my proudest moment at the Continental Congress was 2 years later, in 1776, when I was chairman of the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. And well, of course, you all know that Thomas Jefferson actually wrote the Declaration of Independence, but being chairman of the committee and having also Benjamin Franklin on that committee, we would review Jefferson's drafts and make, suggestions and edits here and there. So, for instance, when Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, I had to object. Franklin, happiness? Happiness is a mere emotion. It's not a positive good or virtue. how will people know what happiness is unless we define it in the text? I asked Franklin. Franklin just laughed. The way he always laughed when he disagreed with me. He was a very annoying man. He said, "John, let's leave Jefferson's language the way it is, because outside of Massachusetts, everyone knows what happiness is." Now, 2 years later, when we were both ambassadors to Paris from the Continental Congress, I discovered that for Franklin, happiness meant the pursuit of happiness meant the pursuit of women. Now, I understand that our country now has a president named Mr. Obama. And when I first heard that name, I was quite surprised, because I had never thought that an Irishman could ever be elected president of the United States, because the Irish, by their very nature and disposition, are so hot-headed and intemperate for that kind of high office. Of course, I learned later that Mr. Obama is not of Irish descent, but of African-American descent, which is an extraordinary thing to think about. You know, I was one of only a few of the founding fathers who did not own an African slaves. Almost all the others did. But from the Adams family, my great-great-great-grandfather, up to myself and my son, etc., we believed slavery to be an abomination. It was a kidnapping, a theft of services. And yet, despite this, I knew that to form a government with the southern colonies, I would have to compromise. And don't think that slavery only existed in the South. No, Abigail's own father had 2 slaves, and he was a congregational minister. Benjamin Franklin, early on in his career, had 2 slaves, which he ultimately freed, and he became a great abolitionist himself. But I felt that I had to compromise, and I rationalized it by the fact of what everyone thought about slavery at the time in the North, was that slavery was going bankrupt. These slave plantations were not making money, and that slavery on its own would just die because it was economically unfeasible. And that was before the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney of New Haven in 1794 and brought great prosperity, unfortunately, to the slave southern plantation system. Now, when I told Abigail about the election of Mr. Obama and how advanced this nation had become, she said, "Well, John, if they're that advanced, why haven't they elected a woman as president?" I think that's a much longer story. You know, Abigail would have made a very good president, but she never would have subjected herself to the nasty presidential campaigns that have marked all of American history right from the beginning. And those of you who think character assassination and slash and burn tactics are recent creations should study the election of 1800, when I ran for re-election opposed by Thomas Jefferson, and it was considered the nastiest election ever, even by today's standards. The things that people said, the things that were done were horrible. One of my critics in that campaign stated that John Adams is mentally deranged, subject to uncontrollable emotional fits. I hate that. And at times absolutely mad. And this critic was Alexander Hamilton. You've heard of that name. First Treasury Secretary and a member of my own Federalist Party. And 4 years after Hamilton wrote this, he was killed in a duel by Vice President Aaron Burr. So those of you who think politics is rough, just think about it. The former Secretary of Treasury is killed by the sitting Vice President, whom I understand was not the last Vice President to shoot somebody. And there was a huge funeral for Hamilton in New York City, and when I was asked if I attended it, I said no, but I approved of it. Now my political enemies, now just to show you that nothing has changed, tried to create a sex scandal about me. Now isn't that ridiculous? Adam, I said ridiculous, not impossible. They said that when I was ambassador to London, my fellow ambassador Charles Pinckney had hired 4 mistresses, 2 for him and 2 for me. When I was asked about that charge, I said that anyone who would think that I would have a mistress, let alone 2 mistresses, had never met Abigail Adams. And charges against Jefferson were just as scurrilous, including the charge that he was an atheist, which I knew from my correspondence and writings was not true. And Abigail could not stand any of this. She used to say, when you hurt him, me, I am the one who bleeds. And you know, presidential politics has been an American blood sport, and especially hard on the families of the candidates, but will probably always be, because the presidency of the United States is the most powerful position in the world. Now, speaking of presidents, how many of you have visited Washington, D.C.? Oh, good. And how many of you have seen the Washington Monument? It doesn't look anything like him, does it? And how many have seen the Jefferson Memorial? And how many have seen the Adams Monument? Oh. That's right. There is no Adams Monument. They skipped right over me. But I don't take it personally. I just think, sort of regional rivalry. Build a monument down here for the local Virginians and forget all about that man from Massachusetts. When Gutzon Borglum was carving Mount Rushmore, and I was told it was the portraits of 4 presidents, so I thought I had a shot. And then I saw it, and I was left out again. And in fact, the only time that I have ever been recognized by the United States government for being president at all was in 2007 when they issued a gold coin, dollar coin, with my likeness on it. Pretty good likeness, but certainly not worth waiting 200 years for. And then I found out all the presidents after me also got their gold coin. So here's a little career tip. And who doesn't eat career tips these days? If you want your accomplishments noted and your achievements celebrated and your memory honored, never ever come after George Washington. Now I have to confess I have another love other than Abigail, and that is for books. Abigail used to say that the Adams would be as wealthy as those aristocrats down in Virginia, like the Madisons and the Monroes, but for her husband's habit of buying books. And indeed, I gathered a library of 3,500 volumes. The largest private library in the colonies except for one library. Whose library do you think that was? Jefferson's. He had a library of more than 7,000 volumes. When my son, John Quincy, was looking at colleges, he visited New Haven to inspect Yale, and afterwards I asked him about it, what he thought of the college. He said, Dad, their library's less than half the size of yours. Now I hope if there are any Yale alumni in the audience, I haven't offended you, because I'm sure your library is much bigger now. And right from the beginning, I've loved books, and my favorite present from my father was a book, and I wrote my autobiography when I received a book from my father, that first one. I was 6 years old, and I gave up all interest in girls and sports, at least for a time. Probably something a modern politician would never want to admit to. In March 24th, 1800, as president, I had the honor of establishing the Library of Congress with an appropriation of $5,000, which was used to purchase 740 books and 13 maps from a London bookseller. And most of the books are on subjects of science, government, law, and history. And books were critically important to us on this side of the Atlantic because we had no experts here. All the experts lived in Europe. And the only way we got their knowledge was to get their books. And this was absolutely true. Even though you had Harvard and Princeton and other, these were not research institutions. They taught, students Latin and Greek and mathematics. And this was so critical for us to get their books. And I want to tell you a story about this, which shows how critical it was. And it's about a young man, he was 24 years old, 1775, just before the British occupied Boston and the Revolutionary War began. And he had, for the previous 4 years, a bookstore, and he called it the London Bookstore. And I used to go there and buy a book every once in a while. His name was Henry Knox. And he was a hugely fat, obese kid, but very enthusiastic about books, especially one subject. One subject, he had every book in the English language on that one subject. It was his favorite subject, and it was called artillery science. He had every book on cannons. How to make them, how to aim them, how to load them, how to move them, how to do whatever it is with cannons. He had that book. He had 11 books. So anyway, the British occupied Boston in the spring of 1775, and Knox closes up his bookshop, takes his 11 books on artillery science, and he goes to Cambridge, where he signs up, or tries to sign up, for the Continental Army. And of course, he's this beast. I mean, he was weighed about 350 pounds. He was about 6'2", 24 years old, had no militariness about him in any shape or form except enthusiasm. And at that time, there were 12,000 British troops, including a fleet of British Navy in Boston. And surrounding Boston were 15,000 to 16,000 Continental Army troops. Continental Army troops had hardly any firepower. They had rifles, no real cannons to speak of. And one side couldn't do anything really to the other side. It was a stalemate. There were some major battles, the Battle of Breed's Hill or Bunker Hill, where there were 1,000 casualties on either side. Huge, huge thing. And so the stalemate went from the spring to the summer, that's where the Battle of Bunker Hill, to now George Washington took command of the Continental Army in the summer of 1775 in Boston, and now we're approaching winter. And Henry Knox is beside himself. He has figured out a plan to get the British out of Boston. And he has to tell General Washington. So he goes to General Washington's headquarters, which is on Brattle Street in Cambridge. If you know it, it's called the Longfellow House. Beautiful place to go to. And he knocks on the door. And they said yes. And again, he really wasn't a soldier. He was never really commissioned, or he never was sworn in, but he would help on installations like in Roxbury, because he was like a born Army engineer, but they never really took him seriously. So had no uniform. They said, yes, can I help you? Well, I want to speak to General Washington. Oh, yes, and what do you want? Well, I have a plan to get the British out of Boston. I want to explain it to him. Oh, you do? Well, General Washington is very busy. He'll have to come back, come back later. Brushed him off. 3 days later, he knocks. Yes, oh yes. Well, can I speak? I have a plan to get the British out of Boston. I want to speak directly to General Washington. Sorry, he's on, inspections. He's not in, and he goes. This happens several times. Now, the fourth time, he actually knocks on the door. General Washington is meeting with his staff in the building at Brown Street. And so the people say, excuse me, General, but there's this young man. He says he has a plan to get the British out of Boston. His name is Henry Knox. We don't know, but he's been back now. This is his fourth time. He wants to speak to you, to tell you this plan. So Washington looks at his staff and says, well, none of you have a plan to get the British out of Boston. Let's hear from this young man. Of course, the young man comes in, and that's not military in the least. So the General Washington says, so Mr. Knox, is it Mr. You have a plan to get the British out of Boston. Explain it to me. Well, General, 6 months ago, we captured Fort Ticonderoga, southern end of Lake Champlain. In Fort Ticonderoga are 59 huge cannons. They're much bigger than any cannons the British have, and of course much bigger than any cannons we have, because we have no cannons. If we can move those cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, put them on Dorchester Heights, which is just outside of Boston, pointing down at the British fleet in the harbor and the British encampment on the shore, the British will leave immediately. So one of his staff says, well, young man, if you had this plan months ago, maybe there would be some feasibility to this, but we're now in the end of November. There's probably already snow and ice on the Berkshire Mountains. How are you going to move them 300 miles? This is the wrong time, the wrong place. It's totally unrealistic. And he said, oh no. The best time to move huge cannons is in the wintertime, because what you do is you put them on sleds and you slide them along the ice and the snow drawn by oxen. And I could move those 59 cannons from Lake Champlain to Boston in 4 weeks. So the staff person says, have you ever moved cannons? No, I haven't. And what was your civilian occupation? Bookseller. Well, how do you know how to move cannons in the wintertime? Well, I've read about it. Oh, you've read about it. So they're all tittering, and General Washington says, young man, do you have any of those books that you read that talks about moving cannons in the wintertime? Yes, I do. And he brought one of the books, and he goes to the page, opens the book to the page that would have a discussion about that, gives the book to General Washington. General Washington reads it, closes the book, and says, give this young man whatever he needs. And on March 5th, 1776, the British woke up and they looked up on Dorchester Heights, and pointing down on them were 59 cannons at their ships and at their encampment. And immediately the British tried to elevate their cannons, but the angle was way too high. And the British general called for a truce so he could have a parley, and he, through representatives, told Washington, if you fire those cannons, I will make sure that Boston is burnt to the ground. I will make sure of that. In Washington, he was a good military man, but he was an even better politician, and he knew that he wouldn't be very popular in Boston if he fired those cannons and basically defeated an army, but also burned down his people's city. And this is what the British says, if you will give me 2 weeks, we will leave, provided you don't fire those cannons. So again, Washington, all right, 2 weeks. And, you know, George Washington, you know, here he has this all set up. He'd like to see what even one shot looked like. But no. So he said, all right, I won't give you 2 weeks, I'll give you 12 days. And on March 17th, the entire British Army and Navy and 2,000 Tories, including a lawyer from Worcester who taught me the law, I read with him, made me a lawyer, left Boston and sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And that day is celebrated in Boston as Evacuation Day. And it's still celebrated as Evacuation Day, although so many people are confusing it with the patron saint of Ireland, who also has parades and other celebrations. But if you are in Boston on that day, it's for Evacuation Day, and if it's for anyone, it's for Henry Knox, not St. Patrick. And what happened to Henry Knox? Well, when he arrived in Dorchester Heights with the 59 cannons, George Washington was there to greet him and gave him a certificate that was from the Continental Congress that made Henry Knox a colonel. He went from nothing to be a colonel. 6 months later, he became a general. And 12 years after that, he became a member of President George Washington's cabinet as Secretary of War. Pretty good for a guy who reads books. And you know, by 1776, Americans were singing a different song other than God Save the King. And the song that became a favorite marching song, and it became really our national anthem at the time, was Yankee Doodle. And it was written by a British Army surgeon to make fun of the American troops. And Yankee was the British word of insult for New Englanders. And doodle meant fool. And the Americans turned it around and made it one of our great rousing songs. I'll just play it for you now. Yankee Doodle went to town, riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy, mind the music and the step, and with the girls be handy. It's sort of I just love it that your historical society and people have the wherewithal and interest, as Mr. Falcone, in this historic flag. Notice it has 15 stripes and 15 stars. And I, as John Adams, in 1777, wrote the first regulation for the American flag. Now remember, Betsy Ross or somebody designed it, but the American flag was the the 13 stars and 13 stripes was being used by many, many of the armed forces. But the problem was it wasn't being used by all the armed forces. And so if you saw a militia from Pennsylvania come over the hill that might be a hill 3 miles away, you could see troops moving, you could see flags waving, but you couldn't identify this flag because they had their own, flag from Philadelphia, or their own flag from whatever the area was. So and also ships at sea. You didn't want to get so close, you say, oh, that's a militia from Maryland, they're okay. Well, they would have already blasted you by then. So they needed a flag that would be identifiable. And John Adams, I wrote that regulation. However, I said that for each star, you have to have an additional stripe. And once they said, well, there's no way we could do the stripes, so they went back to the 13 stripes and the stars for the number of the states. By 1776 at the Continental Congress, I had been trying for more than a year to get the Congress to declare independence from the British Empire. And they were so resistant to that. They were so resistant. And up to that time, I was totally unsuccessful because my arguments were all appeals to the delegates' self-interest, not to their self-sacrifice, not to a higher goal, their self-interest. I argued that we'd have lower taxes, fewer administrative regulations, a better economy if we gained our independence from the British Empire. But men don't fight and die for such small things. And I knew that I had to appeal to that desire in all of us to sacrifice for and work towards a goal that was higher than ourselves. And that was the concept of America. So instead of arguing the benefits of being free of British domination, I presented to the delegates of the Continental Congress a much higher goal. And I'm reading from my notes that I spoke about in that late June and early July 1776. This is what I said: that by a coincidence of circumstances, without precedent in world history, we, the 13 colonies, have been afforded the unique opportunity of beginning government anew from its foundation and build as we choose a government based upon freedom and liberty. How few of the human race have ever been given this opportunity to implement an entirely new kind of government, not based upon a king or an aristocracy or a foreign power, but just ourselves. That we were going down a path never traveled before by anyone in history, and that what we did here in founding America would be an inspiration to the entire world. How could we not take advantage of the chance we had to transform in this place and at this time the course of Western civilization by voting yes for liberty, yes for freedom, and yes for independence? And ladies and gentlemen, it was that argument that got those 13 different colonial clocks to strike in unison in July of 1776. The nation we founded in 1776 would go on to have many more American revolutions in every generation, when ordinary citizens like ourselves would join together, not in self-interest, but in self-sacrifice. To help America in its challenges and its perils, and make this nation a better country. And I want to tell you a final story about George Washington that emphasizes this important point. It's the winter of 1777, and Washington is about to lose his entire army. And he's not going to lose them to the British. He's going to lose them because all of the enlistments, well, like 95% of his soldiers, their enlistments are up. They're up at the end of December. And these men could just depart, and they wouldn't be AWOL, and they wouldn't be deserters. They were contractually there up until December, and that was it. So Washington, to keep his army whole, he had to somehow convince them to re-up. And he called a big assembly, an evening assembly, and there with his 14,000 troops, and how he was able to talk to them all, he must have been a wonderful speaker. He was on his horse with his full uniform, and he explained to his soldiers that the Continental Congress was going to award every soldier who re-upped, re-enlisted, a special 1-month bonus for their re-enlistment. And the pay for a soldier, the 1-month pay for a soldier at that time was $10, equivalent to about $2,000 in today's currency. And so he said that at the end of June, next June, they would each receive this 1 month's bonus. And then he asked everyone who would re-enlist to please step forward. And no one stepped forward. 14,000 soldiers stayed right in place. And it said that the look of shock on Washington's face was apparent to everyone close at hand. And Washington turned his horse and he galloped away about 100 yards and stopped. The soldiers looked at him and he was stopped. And then he turned his horse and rode back to his troops, and he said these words: "If you will come with me in the next 6 months, you and I can do more in that period of time than you could if you went home and lived another 50 years. Because in the next 6 months, you and I can help protect this nation, the United States of America, whose liberty will be a blessing for all your future generations. Now, who will serve with me?" And everyone stepped forward. And all of them knew that Washington was no longer talking about $10, was he? He was talking about their souls and what kind of spiritual inheritance they could give to their sons and their daughters. Now, I'd like to sing a song that was first sung by Nora Jones in Ken Burns' documentary on the Second World War in 2008. And this song was later sung at the dedication of the 9/11 Memorial at the Pentagon in 2008. It's called "America, I Gave My Best to You," and it's about America's tradition of self-sacrifice that's been handed down from generation to generation. All we've been given by those who came before, a dream of a nation where freedom would endure the work and prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy? What shall our children say? Let them say of me, I was one who believed in sharing the blessings I received. Let me know in my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you. America, America, I gave my best to you. One of the themes about America is that we took the best the British gave us and we improved it. Even their songs, you remember that first song that I sang, God Save the King? Well, we changed the words to it and now it's one of our favorite anthems. And you all learned it in kindergarten. It's called My Country 'Tis of Thee. And I'd like you to join with me in singing it, and sing it as if you are hearing the lyrics the first time. My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my father died, land of thy pilgrim's pride, from every mountain side, let freedom ring. You've been a very gracious audience, and may God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.